Hi all. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about articulatory processes. So we've been talking about phonetics primarily to this point, as if it's these isolated sounds, these phones. But what we recognize when we actually listen to produced speech, right, people actually speaking, is that sounds can impact one another and people can pronounce things differently, okay? So it's important to notice that this part of the chapter is talking about actual speech production and the phenomenon of co-articulation, okay? So in our elementary study of phonetics, we were interested in phonetic segments, individual phones in isolation, right? The kind of idealized pronunciation of each sound. However, speech sounds do not exist in isolation. When they're produced, they're most often produced as a series of phones that together make up an expression, right? We put a series of phones together to make a word or to make a phrase or a clause or a sentence, right? So while we have talked up to this point mainly about individual phones, at this point we're going to think more about what happens when we put them together. And what we find is when we produce certain speech sounds in a series, we can see that the articulation of one sound often affects the articulation of another. Co-articulation is a term we use to label this phenomenon in which more than one articulator is active as we move from one speech sound to the next. In other words, we are forming different sounds as we move from one sound to the next. And if those sounds are far apart, having them be co-articulated means that we are having to transition from one part of our mouth to another part of our mouth. And in doing so, we might actually change one or both of those sounds to make it easier to pronounce. Okay? So co-articulation can result in recognizable articulatory processes. That is, we can observe regular change in the same way across different contexts in different languages. That allow for more efficient articulation of a series of sounds. In other words, make it easier to say. For example, the flap in place of the T sound in a word like butter. We don't say butter. In American English, we say butter. Or a more distinct output that's easier to perceive than fluent everyday speech. So something we do to accentuate. Notice what I did right there. I slowed down, accentuate. By, in this case, lengthening segments. But we'll talk about some other ways that happens as well. So when we transcribe actual speech, we may notice differences in pronunciation that are systemic, like these articulatory processes we're going to talk about. But we should also notice that there are also just social and regional differences that can be observed, and that some differences are actually idiosyncratic. That means they're unique to individual people. Right? So even though many people might do it, they're not doing it as part of a group, right? They're individual expressions. And some of them may be unique to an individual. That is, an individual learned a particular word incorrectly at some point, and it stuck with them, and they always say it that way, okay? If you're interested in social and regional differences, we'll talk about sociolinguistics at the end of the semester. Okay, so today we're going to talk about some common articulatory processes. So these articulatory processes, as I said, are processes we can observe for the ways in which different sounds impact one another in speech production. And these, it's important to notice, some are more common or less common than they are in English. They're more common or less common in other languages. But it is, all of these can be observed in English, and we're going to talk about assimilation and dissimilation, which has to do with the impact of sounds, whether they become more similar or different, depending on how they are typically articulated. Deletion and epithesis, which are either the removal of sound or the addition of a sound. And metathesis, which has to do with word order. One of the ways we commonly think about this is as a child speech production issue, where a child might say paschetti instead of spaghetti because it's easier to pronounce. But it also happens in adult speech, especially in different groups. And finally, we're going to talk about vowel reduction, which is not fewer vowels, but a change in the way a vowel might be produced based on whether it is stressed or unstressed in a word. So let's start with assimilation. We're talking about assimilation. We can talk about different forms of assimilation. Assimilation is a very common practice or a very common process. What that means is that when sounds are together they're going to be pronounced or produced together, so one after another, they oftentimes impact each other by becoming more similar in some way. So assimilation for voice would mean that a sound takes on the same voice as a nearby sound. So a sound that is typically not voiced can become voiced, or a sound that's typically voiceless can become, did I say that? Voiceless can become voiced, and voiced can become voiceless, right? So one common example in English is found in the production of consonant clusters at the beginning of words, where normally voiced liquids take on the voiceless quality of the preceding voiceless consonant. So think about the words please and proud. Okay, now, I just said please, right? We don't normally say please, we say please. And we don't normally say proud, we say proud. So you notice how the aspirated voiceless P sound, the P, turns those liquids from voiced, because liquids are voiced typically, into voiceless liquids. So they have that aspiration after them, right? Or so please and proud, you hear that little puff of air? That's voiceless, right? So they're aspirated. They become aspirated sounds. So please and proud. We don't say please, right? We don't let that P stay voiceless and that L stay voiced. Now, some people do, and in some contexts, you certainly can, right? People go please, right, to accentuate it. But a typical American pronunciation will change that second letter to be devoiced or to be voiceless, like the P that precedes it, okay? That's just one example, right? An example of place, an assimilation of place of articulation, in other words, in the position of your mouth in articulation, have to do with the many common examples in English when we have a nasal consonant like M or N, right? You can feel that air going through your nasal cavity, and it impacts the place of articulation of the consonant that follows. For example, the book talks a lot about negatives like impossible, right? Impossible changes the sound of possible, impossible. But I like the example of the word anchorage. So we don't say anchorage. Instead, that N sound becomes an ng sound, an ing, anchorage, because that ch that creates a K, right, is harder to pronounce with the nasal, and so we drag them together with that ng sound, okay? In other words, they become more similar because they're pronounced in that same area of your mouth. Manner of articulation, whether things are stops or fricatives or nasals or liquids or whatever, we can see the perfect example in the example I said before about flapping, where we see like in the word butter, right? We don't say butter. But we also see we can see it in phrases, and I like this example. We don't say I bought it, we say I bought it, because it's much easier to turn that T stop into a flap. I bought it, okay? And that's assimilation. Dissimilation is the opposite of assimilation and is much rarer in speech production. It's the articulatory process of dissimilation. Okay, well, I keep getting interrupted, but here we go. The opposite of assimilation is dissimilation. Dissimilation is a rarer speech production issue, but it is the articulatory process in which a sound changes to be less like a nearby sound, so it's the resulting sequence of sounds are easier to produce. So common examples have to do with, in English, have to do with those numbers that end with a consonant cluster. So fifths, it's kind of hard to say, right? Fifths. For a lot of people becomes fifths. they put a T sound instead of a TH sound. It breaks up those three fricatives with a stop. T is a stop, right? And it makes it easier to say for some speakers, and ultimately makes it easier to understand as well. So fifths instead of fifths. We also see in deletion that some people will just say fifths, just say F-I-F-S, fifths, because it's easier to say. A similar but different process happens with tenths. So tenths, you notice that you have your nasal in, right, which we make in the alveolar region. And then we have the S, which is also an alveolar sound. But that TH sound, the voiceless TH, which is represented there, is an interdental. In other words, your tongue moves between your teeth to make it, right? So you're going from alveolar to interdental to alveolar. So some people find it much easier to pronounce if they say tenths, right? So the tenths that you're counting, in that case, our tongue can all remain in the alveolar region because that T stop is also an alveolar sound, okay? So that's what dissimilation is, right? That sometimes there's a change, in this case, that differentiates rather than becoming more similar to the sounds around it. Deletion or elision, they mean the same thing, right? They mean removing something, omitting something. So the process of deletion removes a sound from a series of speech sounds. There's lots of common examples in English. The deletion of a schwa when the vowel is stressed is an example from your book. So suppose, parade, and corrode for some speakers, especially when we speak quickly, can be spose, prayed, and crowed. Notice that schwa sound can be deleted, and because the stress is on the second syllable. Okay. The deletion of the first R is another interesting one, and it happens when there are multiple R sounds in the same word. For example, caterpillar. I'm sure if you think about it, you either say or know someone who says caterpillar without that first R sound, caterpillar. And certainly you've heard people or say library instead of library, and governor instead of governor, right? Governor. So a lot of these are typical, particularly in informal speech, because they're just easier to say. Epenthesis is the opposite process, right? It's the process of adding a segment to a phonetic series, and it's common in casual speech as well. We're going to talk about two different examples. One is an example of consonant epenthesis. So for example, inserting a P sound between an M and a theta to ease the shift between a sonorant sound and a non-sonorant or voiceless TH sound, because the P sound shares the articulation with M, it's a bilabial, and the non-sonorance or voicelessness of the theta, right? And so it helps transition. So something instead of something, right? You notice how your lips are already closed from the M? It becomes really easy to make that P sound something. I have something to tell you versus something, right? It actually kind of smooths the word out, makes it easier to say. It can also make it a little bit easier to understand, once again, because you're adding a syllable which elongates that transition in the word. Vowel epenthesis is also present in English, right? Less so. One way we hear in some regional dialects is when our diphthongs are actually separated into separate vowel sounds. They become separate syllables, okay? And there's a special word for that phenomenon, which is diaeresis. But one that I find really interesting is we can observe the addition of a vowel in a name like Dwight. So a lot of people, instead of saying Dwight, will say DeWitt, right? Where is Dwight, right? You hear that? Instead of where's Dwight, where's Dwight, Dwight, right? Some people even go so far as to say D-White, in which case you would change the vowel sound. But a very typical sound that can be removed and can be added in when we're talking about vowels is that schwa sound. Okay. Metathesis is the process that changes the order of segments. Metathesis is common in the speech of young children, as I mentioned, but it also emerges in varietal dialects of English, the most common of which is the word ask. So the word ask, if we were to place it in its typical pronunciation, right, we would have the S followed by the K. However, certainly there are large groups of people, American speakers, who use the word and say ax me a question, for example. Remember, as linguists, we're not interested particularly in what is correct and incorrect, but in observing and describing phonetically that which we hear, right? So while as teachers, some of us might go, ax, that's completely wrong, as linguists, we're not interested in that. We're interested in representing the sounds as they come out, right? So ask is a varietal and social, in a variety of varietal and social dialects in English. We should recognize that. It's common, okay? Vowel reduction is the final articulatory process we'll talk about today. Once again, it doesn't mean there are fewer vowels. It means there's a shift in the vowel from its full vowel sound to a more centralized or a backing position in the mouth in the way we pronounce it. So you think about vowels, right? Everything is talk about height, and we talk about backness, right? So front high vowels can become centralized in that graphical form we looked at last time. In English, this is most noticeable in the change in pronunciation between different forms and or contexts of words. So examples like we go from Canada to Canadian, that first syllable shifts to a schwa, which is a very central sound. But my favorite example we can see in the Department of Defense. We say defense because the stress is on the second syllable, defense, right? Whereas our team has played great defense. We talk about sports, for example, right? In which case the accent is on, or the stress is on the first syllable, and therefore it is the full vowel sound, the E, right? Defense. So I think that's a great example of what vowel reduction can look like in English. And it has to do, once again, with production and not at all with spelling. You'll see that these are spelled exactly the same. So remember, as always, we're talking about phonetics. We're talking about sounds. We're talking about those sound segments, those phones, and how we can describe them with a phonetic alphabet, which represents sounds, not spelling. Okay? So as always, if you have questions, let me know. I'm here to help. Shoot me an email and be in touch. Bye.